Shalom Aleichem, teure Freund. Ich heiße Perlin und ich bin ein New Yorker Jid in China. Unser jetziges Programm ist gewidmet die verschwundene Lechones. Ein Thema, was ist mir sehr nahe zum Herzen.
That was Ross Perlin reporting in Yiddish about disappearing languages in China. The video report, produced by the Jewish Daily Forward, was one of several from Perlin's series called A New York Jew in China, a project he undertook while conducting PhD research on the Trung language. Perlin is now co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance in New York and the author of Language City, about the fight to preserve languages. A Stanford alum, Perlin returned to campus to deliver the Toby Center's annual Clara Sumpf lecture series, which includes one lecture entirely in Yiddish and one in English. Perlin is presented here in conversation with Eitan Kensky, the Reinhardt family curator of Hebraica and Judaica at Stanford Libraries. Together they ask, how did the study of an endangered language in the Eastern Himalayas spark a passion for Yiddish? What is the role of cultural production in preserving languages, and is there an imperative to be a culture maker? And is there something particularly Jewish about the drive to preserve linguistic diversity? And now, the conversation.
Ross Perlin, thank you for joining us today on the Toby Center for Jewish Studies podcast. We're mostly going to be talking this morning about your work on endangered languages and Jewish sociolinguistics, but I want to start with a question about starting, actually, specifically one about origins. You essentially tell two origin stories in your book, Language City. One, how you became a linguist, and two, how you immersed yourself in the Yiddish world and got to know Boris Sandler. First, for the benefit of our audience, could you give a short version of each? And second, how do you weave them together? In what ways did the Yiddish learning and the linguistics and the international fieldwork come together to form your professional journey?
Well, thanks for having me, Eitan. I really came to Yiddish in Southwest China, of all places, although it was present in an ambient way growing up in a New York Jewish family that had Yiddish speakers, and it was certainly the first language of my grandparents' generation, although they really shifted to English, and I didn't really hear Yiddish growing up as a full spoken language. I certainly heard lots of individual words and had certain impressions, and occasionally went to the Yiddish theater and had a connection. I didn't really have an appreciation of Yiddish culture or Yiddish language in a fuller sense really until my 20s. And the way I tell the story in the book is, in some sense, how I felt it. Perhaps it's a simplified version, but it was a moment when I was researching this language Trung as part of my dissertation in Southwest China, through this interest I had developed in endangered languages, which itself had come about when I was studying Mandarin in China as an undergraduate. And I met this Chinese linguist, went to a talk where he kind of explained his life's work. This is the late Sun Hongkai, a veteran Chinese linguist who has documented many of China's 300 plus languages. And I ended up kind of following in his footsteps, going to Southwest China, the most linguistically diverse part of China, the Eastern Himalaya. I had had no idea up to that point, until I was basically 20 years old, that there were 7,000 plus languages in the world, that half of them were endangered, that was precisely the half that we knew the least about, that were the least documented, no books, no recordings in many cases, no dictionaries. So there I was doing my, what would become my PhD work, a dictionary, a set of texts, a grammar of this language, Trung, spoken in one valley by about 7,000 people. And there's a feast being held in my honor, I guess you could say, in this village with a lot of people that I've been recording and working with. And I'm asking them, as one does in this kind of research, I want to hear some of your songs. Like, I haven't been able to record many songs. Let's, we're all having a good time. And they're singing. And then one of the guys turns to me and, says, well, what about your songs? Let's hear you sing some. And there were other moments like it, but that was a moment when it crystallized. I was kind of forced to think about what were my songs. And, there were fragments of some American pop songs. There were some things from summer camp. But on a deeper level, when I thought about that, it led me towards Yiddish, and the question of Yiddish as an endangered language, which is a complex one in many ways. It's not an endangered language anymore, you could say, although certainly has had some of the same kind of characteristics and history of other endangered languages. So in a sense, the two are intertwined. And it was after that I ultimately, returning to the U.S., became more immersed in the Yiddish world. But even at that point, I started to teach myself and subscribe to the forwards. I became the only forward subscriber in Southwest China for thousands of miles. It was great, actually, to get uncensored news, because I got it post-restant in Kunming, which is, where didn't necessarily at all times have a fixed address. It was easier to get it at the central post office in the city. And they would always kind of tear open the plastic at first to sort of see what is this newspaper. But then once they figured out they couldn't read it, it was like, all right, well, let this guy have his news in whatever language this is. And that was around that time that, somebody connected me with Boris Sandler, the editor, and he was like, oh, you're in Southwest China. You're reading the forwards. You should make some videos for us. I was already doing video recording for the work on Turong. So, that became the genesis of Der New Yorker Jid in China, the New York Jew in China, that video series. And it was just a kind of an initial step into the Yiddish world.
So part of why I've been wondering, and part of the prodding to weave them together is simply to wonder, do you think your instinct for linguistic preservation would have been so high without the Yiddishist sense of the need to fight to preserve Yiddish? Your book really nicely describes several salvage projects for Yiddish in the 1960s and the 1970s. The scramble to collect words, the scramble to record songs, the desire to collect Yiddish books. Yiddish film preservation also dates to this time. So on the one hand, there's a general principle that cultural preservation happens when interested parties start to note the death and disappearance of a body of speakers or performers. On the other hand, there's a particular Yiddishist sensitivity to these touch points because of this feeling of endangerment that you've talked about. So how much have the efforts to preserve secular Yiddish been on your mind when you work and devise programs to document other languages?
Some of the Yiddishist projects, including the ones you mentioned, the Yiddish Book Center, the major project, the Linguistic Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry at Columbia. I mentioned some of these in the book. Ben Stonehill's work in the Hotel Marseille with Holocaust survivors, the incredible kind of dictionary projects and other things have been an inspiration to me, certainly, and, would be the envy of other language activists. And I think Yiddishists have been in some ways pioneers in this larger world of working on linguistic and cultural preservation. And while certainly articulating things in terms of Yiddish specifically, have also been at times alert to wider resonances as well. Joshua Fishman is a clear kind of link between these worlds. He was, of course, an important figure in the Yiddish world, but also, as I mentioned in the book, the last time I saw him before he passed away was at this gathering where language activists from around the world were honoring him, including a Maori group who did a haka in his honor. This is a sort of classic kind of Maori dance. And he was a major sort of theorist of language endangerment and how you maintain a language, and was, of course, part of some of these projects. And similarly, we know Max Weinreich in the Yiddishist world, but then also his son Uriel Weinreich was a major figure in linguistics who kind of thought about language contact and opened up vistas for language work and language activists everywhere. So these things have been on my mind, and I, in some ways, have felt that by being a bit of a bridge between the two worlds, drawing on lessons from the Yiddish world for wider application, but then also bringing back some lessons from elsewhere and seeing how they might work within the world of Yiddish, creating new work in Yiddish where possible. That was certainly the goal of the New York Jew in China videos and some of the subsequent ones, is to make those connections, but also broaden horizons all around. And I think that there is a sort of a deeper Yiddishist spirit that should be outward facing as well. Certainly there are plenty of work that needs to happen kind of within Yiddish alone. And Jewish languages more broadly also is, I think, a field where Yiddishists like Weinreich and Shlomi Birnbaum also were quite important in terms of theorizing work on Jewish languages more generally, understanding from Yiddish that we need to look at how Jews were communicating and shaping their linguistic identities everywhere across this kind of almost global diaspora. So I think these things are all sort of intertwined, and we need to just find ways to stretch and weave the web.
That connects to something that I wanted to ask you about, which is the main topic of your Yiddish lecture yesterday was Jewish sociolinguistics. And it seemed as if you were asserting a principle that caring deeply about the specifics of global culture is a Jewish value. You draw on a tradition of Jewish linguists, some of whom you just mentioned right now, who came from mixed Jewish backgrounds, some traditional, some not, but who are all in a sense responding to the Jewish Enlightenment and the transformation of Jewish values into a more globally oriented world system. Do you think that's a fair depiction? Should it be qualified in any way? Have you always imagined yourself in a lineage with these linguists, or is that kind of a newer construction that you've been doing?
Each case is different and interesting. How much we see a Franz Boas or an Edward Sapir or a Benjamin Worf, or an Ansky or the group of Narodnik Russian linguists that I had mentioned last time as well, Jokelson and Sternberg and Tan Bogaraz, how much we understand them within sort of Jewish traditions, intellectual or otherwise, is variable in each case. But it does seem that somewhere in the genesis of linguistics over the past couple of century plus and of anthropology and of curiosity about the peoples of the world and the sort of forging and understanding of a world culture, actually, in a way. I think there's even a line of Mandelstam's. It talks about like nostalgia for world culture. I don't remember what he means exactly or what the original Russian is, and it goes back to the stereotype of the cosmopolite or the cosmopolitan, rootless or otherwise, that has often kind of accompanied the question of Jewishness. Certainly, I feel safer Jewishly in a world where all cultures can be freely developed and valued and understood. And certainly there's the question of sort of a minority with other minorities. New York, which is the site of Language City and the site for so much of our work, I think also kind of inscribes this idea where it's actually through kind of there not being any sort of hegemonic majority group, but in fact a plethora of variation and a sort of a respect for that and even a relativism to a degree around that I think we can square the classic dialectic of particularism and universalism, which of course always characterizes a lot of questions of Jewish thought. So I think there are threads here. I don't want to pull on them too heavily since I think they form a very delicate and even tender quilt, if those metaphors make any sense. But I do discern a tradition, and it has come to be quite meaningful to me. And I see the tendrils in various places. I see it, in other traditions as well. But I do want to keep this one alive where there is a specifically Jewish concern or value with not only Jewish particularity, but with all particularities.
Yeah, I think we've seen this tension a lot over the last year and a half, where there are people who look at what's happening and think, I'm Jewish because I feel marginalized right now. And there are people who say, my Jewish identity comes from thinking about the marginalization of others and pondering it.
Right.
So I'm probably going to annoy some of our listeners. Halabai, we should have listeners for me to annoy them by continuing to ask you questions about Yiddish. But what our listeners at home probably don't know is that the reason that they are listening to you right now on this podcast while they're washing dishes or doing whatever else they're doing is that you came here to be our Clara Sumpf lecturer. This is a rather unusual series in that the lecturer is required to give one talk in English on their subject and one in Yiddish. And again, for the benefit of our audience who have now finished washing their dishes and have moved into repose, I think that this is the first time a Stanford undergraduate alum has given the Sumpf lecture. So what was it like for you to write an academic lecture in Yiddish? As you said during the talk, you often will lecture on specific Yiddish cultural topics when you are speaking in Yiddish. You've talked about Shalom Aleichem, but not necessarily the work of endangered languages. So did it feel good? Did you feel constrained? Did it confirm any feelings that you may have about the Yiddishist mentality to form neologisms and to wonder, wie sagt man auf Yiddish?
I love the challenge of it. I've given a few talks in Yiddish in the past, but never on this topic, which was Jewish linguistic diversity more broadly. And I specifically didn't talk that much about Yiddish and spent more time on the Juhuri language of the so-called mountain Jews of Azerbaijan and Dagestan, the Bukhari language of the Bulgarian Jews of Central Asia, the Neo-Aramaic varieties spoken by some Jewish communities originally in northern Iraq and Iran, as these languages have come to New York. That was some of the focus of the talk. And so to even figure out what names of the languages to use, since there aren't necessarily even established names in Yiddish or ways of talking about some of these places or ideas. On the one hand, as I said, there were sort of pioneering Yiddishists, and there is work in Yiddish about Jewish sociolinguistics or interlinguistics, as it has also been called. But also there were a number of things that I came across where I was like, I'm not sure exactly how to say this. And on the one hand, not going to be purist, occasionally drop in a word in English or actually pulling words from these languages themselves. But it's a great challenge. And to what we were just saying before, I really value this particular takon that the Sumpf lecture should include a Yiddish talk, and would just love to see many other. There should be likewise for many languages, it's very rare, as our friend and colleague Charles Peterson pointed out, I think, to have an academic lecture in the United States that has a requirement that it be in a language other than English. But let a thousand flowers bloom, there should be. And the process was challenging because I'm not speaking Yiddish on a daily basis, unfortunately. There have been times when that almost has been the case, and there are certainly those opportunities in New York. I'm living not far from, certainly not within, but not far from Hasidic communities where Yiddish is the language of daily life, and there are plenty of opportunities to hear it. And then there's a world of Yiddishists, especially there, as I describe a little bit in the Yiddish section of my book, that are meeting frequently and that are using the language. And certainly thanks to the efforts of the Yiddish Book Center and others, you could spend all of your time listening to the wonderful oral histories compiled by Krista Whitney and others at the Steiner Oral History Project or the Montreal Public Library Yiddish recordings that exist. So there is, to Duncan, an incredible amount of material that one can be immersed in, but I'm also spending time on languages from Nepal and from China and from elsewhere. So I had to dig back in and write out a certain amount of it, certainly, but at the same time wanting it to be in the spirit of Balpé, of the orality, and talking about oral languages as well, but also to connect with those who had come even from as far as Walnut Creek, I understand, all the way to Palo Alto to hear a Yiddish word, and the others who came. So, I wanted it to also have a conversational feeling, and we had a nice all-in Yiddish Q&A session afterwards. So it was a COVID and a machaya to have that opportunity and to come back to this place, to come back to Stanford, where I was an undergraduate, with the terets of Yiddish is a particularly piquant kind of pleasure.
What do you think our audience should know about Jewish languages that they don't? What misconception do you want to clear up?
Well, first of all, that there are Jewish languages besides Hebrew, Yiddish, and Ladino. This is usually the first thing that needs to be mentioned. People often are not very aware that in almost every context, Jewish communities developed different varieties, repertoires, ways of speaking, including these forms of Jewish Neo-Aramaic, Judeo-Arabic, Jehuri, Bukhari that I mentioned, the languages of the Jews of Iran, which were quite distinct from the Farsi of Tehran. So on the one hand, just the diversity, we're talking about a few dozen varieties at least. And actually, when we're talking about things like Judeo-Arabic, and of course it's become harder and harder, it's vanishingly few people who today still remember what these ways of speaking were like, that they varied often from town to town. I met somebody who was from Benghazi originally, who told me the Jews of Benghazi had a particular expressions, particular ways of speaking in Libya versus those from Gerber, Algiers, and so on. So there was just real local variation. Of course, it had to do with the co-territorial populations, but also the specific Jewish histories and trajectories of those places, which are now just almost totally forgotten. What's extraordinary now is there still is a chance some of these people are still alive in places like New York and LA and in Israel and in a few other places. And one can still talk to them and interview them and find material and understand. A related misconception is that they are all languages that can easily be delineated and put between the covers of a book. Whereas in many cases, there was quite an interesting linguistic flexibility and creativity, and people could choose from more of a repertoire of features that might range from almost identical to their non-Jewish neighbors to being quite distinct. So that's why a sociolinguistic approach that's more focused on individual features and variation and linguistic agency and creativity is really valuable. And I should also add that there's just a woeful lack of support and documentation for this work. We have this Jewish Languages Project, which I discussed at the Endangered Language Alliance, which I co-direct. We work with partners who are doing great work all the way from LA, Sarah Benor and the Jewish Languages Project there, which is a pioneer, to work in Israel, Yehudit with the Lashon Project and others. But in no case is there really substantial support for this work. And so it's happening kind of piecemeal as one can, but not nearly quickly or in depth as much as it should be. And I think it's not just about the past of Jewish diversity. It's also about what the future could be and showing that. And it's very pertinent, I think, to all kinds of contemporary debates to understand that this is not a sort of monolithic linguistic and ethno-linguistic and cultural and religious identity. And with the loss of the diversity of Golis, of Galut, we need to find ways to regenerate value, understand it, be connected to it.
So one of the things that pleased me immensely about your book is that a reader can see by carefully studying the footnotes that you draw quite a bit on an essay you wrote for the Yiddish Studies web journal in Geweb, What Was the Kultur Tour? I've always loved this essay, and I think it's worth quoting from. I'm going to ask you to read a passage.
Specialization is a luxury that smaller cultures can rarely afford. Instead, everyone lends a hand. Absent government support or a culture industry, activists for small-scale stateless cultures are effectively on their own. Borrowing, translating, and adapting from other cultures or a culture's own folk sources can only go so far. Reference works, periodicals, websites, research institutes, performance venues, elements such as a standardized language and a common orthography that we take entirely for granted, creating a modern culture requires an enormous amount of work, often unpaid and almost always uncertain.
So perhaps this is an echo of what I asked you earlier, but do you see the people you work with at the ELA, the speakers of the many endangered languages who come to document them, help spread them, to work on children's books as kulturtours? Is this a term you've shared with mixed text speakers or speakers from Central Asia? Is this something that Yiddish can bring to this community and this concept?
I think so. I love the term, and I live in Givet, by the way. And the footnotes are where all of the best stuff in Language City is buried. And a particular interest of mine, and I try to do it here and there in the book, others are doing this as well, is to theorize and think from the world's languages. So there are concepts, there are ideas in every language that actually can be helpful to speakers of every other language, and they enrich our whole vocabulary of conceptual knowledge. And I think that the Kulturtour, and this is why I wrote about it for In Geweb, and I worked in my time as a translation fellow at the book center as well on a series of essays by a consummate Kulturtour, Moshe Starkman, because I think this is something that, although not 100% specifically and purely from Yiddish, it actually has interesting roots in worlds of German and Russian and other European cultures around that time, and related to other terms like the Gesellschaftliche Tour and so on. It is something which developed a particularly kind of Yiddish Tam flavor through the history of this stateless language where you needed, as we just heard, to sort of do it yourself. And it's a sort of DIY culture avant la lettre, where, everybody has to lend a hand and get involved and sort of do the culture. You can't just wait around for it to be done. And I think very much the people that we work with at the Endangered Language Alliance are Kulturtour. And I think there are one or two people in the Himalayan world who I've mentioned this to, who are consummate Kulturtour, classic. So the question is, how do these concepts get shared? How do they get implemented? I think the most important thing is, again, doing the work and creating the conditions for Kulturtour to do what they do. And that's what we try to do at the Endangered Language Alliance.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about Boris Sandler and your relationship with Boris. He appears without a name in your book, but it's couldn't be anyone else. You are one of a cadre of young writers or Yiddish lovers that Boris seemed to be nurturing, for a career as a Yiddish writer, or at least as a side hustle that doesn't pay or a passion project. Did you feel like you were part of a cohort? Did you feel like this was a worthwhile experiment and that these kind of new Yiddish culture makers were put out into this world? Was it a success?
Boris is a Kulturtour and more, a novelist, a musician, a poet, an editor, longtime editor of the Yiddish Daily Forward, the Vorwärts, the Yiddish edition, but also a prolific writer in other ways. And today runs the Yiddish Branche, which is another extraordinary online publication with lots of new Yiddish writing. I hope that the portrait, although a miniature, essentially, there should be a fuller biography in Language City, does some modicum of justice to his work. And we've now, known each other for getting close to 2 decades. And all of those video series that I mentioned, a few dozen videos were made for him and under his redaktia, his editorship. So I would be honored to be in any way considered an onhanger of his or a chassid of his. I mean, he's a unique figure that I wanted to profile in the book, not just because I've known him and had a longitudinal sense of some of his life and work, but born in post-war Moldova at a time when in very few other places in the world could you have a real Yiddish-speaking childhood in a non-Hasidic community? But it was possible in Belz, mein Städtele Belz, where Boris was born right after the war, and then had a sort of a unique experience in the last period of the Soviet Union as well, with the sort of great last generation of Soviet Yiddish writers, and then went to Israel, and then has been in Brooklyn for the last 20 years. So he stands in a very kind of unique position, I think. And then he's just, fiercely creative. I mean, the cohort of people that kind of have trained with him includes Evgeny Kissin, the famous classical pianist, who's also now a wonderful Yiddish writer. So, it's Boris's faith, his fierce faith in the future of Yiddish creativity and the imperative that you just do the work, you just do it, and you don't wait around and you don't talk about it, you just do it and create new work, is a lodestar for me. I think that I wish I was doing more. I think to be truly of that cadre, I should be trying to write a Yiddish novel. I should be trying to translate some of Boris's work, some of which still is untranslated. I would like to think I've been able to absorb some of the lessons and some of the magic, while at the same time, clearly, I've had a more diffuse focus, if that's not a contradiction in terms, towards a wider remit, including many of the world's languages.
He was one of a cluster of kind of these late Soviet Yiddish writers who emerged, and along with Michal Felsenbaum and Moshe Lemster, who really have together and separately are forming new journals to try and keep, the spark alive. Yiddish Branja you mentioned. There's a relatively recent one in Israel that's put out by Felsenbaum, and it's really fascinating to see these people fight so hard through all stages to find that new form. The website, the Forverts isn't supported anymore, so you have your own shingle of a website. Yeah. Or in Israel, figuring out, well, the state institution that supports Yiddish is minuscule, but here's what it can do, and here's how we work that system to try and get it out there.
There's an intensity, I think, that may be born of the Soviet experience of a sense of that you have, in some ways, organic or continuous connection with certain aspects of the Eastern European Jewish inheritance, combined with the Soviet experience and the of to fight and to keep doing it. Not that there aren't other currents, but I am continually astonished by that generation.
One last explicitly Yiddish-related question. You paint this contrast in your Boris chapter between a rapid disappearance of the Eastern European Yiddish homeland and the secular culture it nourished on the one side, and the flourishing of modern Hasidic Yiddish as a thriving, young, growing language on the other. Hasidic Yiddish may not have an army and a navy, but it has shomrim and school board control. Do you think Hasidic Yiddish has created the toehold to continue thriving? You mentioned that the only analogous situation is probably the Pennsylvania Dutch community of speakers. What does it mean that linguistic diversity is potentially only sustained via conscious religious separation?
There may be a few other related cases. I just heard something about a community related to Pennsylvania Dutch, speaking Swiss German, who are actually in Indiana and who are also a religious minority. Another intriguing comparison that I make in passing is with African American English, which is on a much wider scale and has a whole other complex set of issues. But indeed, the passing on of Yiddish in the Hasidic community in Brooklyn, above all, and now going into the fourth and fifth generation is something unique and new, and that I do try to spend some time on in this chapter as an addition and a counterpoint to the story of Boris. It is, I think, in many ways about the shomrim and the school boards and the yeshivas and so on and housing, as much as it is about the kind of mishugan koyach, the crazy force of will that is born of a sense of religious belonging and intensity. So it's the institution building that is particularly impressive to me. And the institution building is not specifically around Yiddish as such, which is interesting. It's kind of in the breach. It's the understanding that Yiddish can be a marker of separateness, that it can be a convenient envelope for even the sort of more fundamental concerns of frumkeit. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see where it goes from here, because it's now going beyond New York, where it was nurtured in this very Jewish city that, again, it was actually, I think, in terms of immigration waves, largely this post-war migration, especially many who'd survived the Holocaust, and so had a completely different historical trajectory from people like my great-grandparents who were fleeing the Russian Empire and were embracing ultimately assimilation and so on, and then became products of the New York City public schools, which became engines of assimilation. And that was understood by, I think, the later arrivals who then were like, we need to build our own schools. We need to build our own system. So it's more than a toehold. It's at least a foothold now. And what happens when it goes beyond New York, and of course it's also in certain other parts of the world, in other cities, it could go in many different directions. Of course, there's been a lot of focus on those who leave the community, who in some cases then enrich the Yiddishist world because they're able to, even without leaving it necessarily, they have that sort of native, hush to Yiddish. But there are things that will also be missing, and secular Treffen literature and certain kinds of things, and certain varieties as well, dialects that are not part of the particular Hasidic world, are very much still endangered. And so I think there's also a role for the Yiddishists, however academic they may be in certain cases, or even if it's as a second language or in post-vernacular kinds of uses. I hope that there will continue to be a certain kind of complementarity, even in the breach between all the different parties who are part of the party of Yiddish.
I mean, I think that point about the coming later, coming in the kind of post-Holocaust moment is actually really quite interesting and important and often neglected. There is a kind of Yiddish baby boom generation, secular Yiddishists whose, you could say, parents also came from DP camps and places like that. People don't often know this, but the immediate post-Holocaust years were a second major influx of Yiddish speakers to New York. Right. People were reconstituting communities. Journals were getting restarted. It's been called a silver age of Yiddish publishing for the amount of material that took place. And unfortunately, the birth rates of that generation was fairly small, but it did lead to such things. Many of the Yiddish faculty members we've been reading for the last 20, 30 years were raised in this context.
That's very important. The number of key figures in the Yiddishist world who were born in DP camps or have that kind of connection, it's significant. And it's just then a whole different orientation. I mean, the DP camps were themselves a place of great Yiddish creativity, right? As soon as people were in those camps, liberated from the concentration camps, in the DP camps, they were, publishing Yiddish journals, I think, and putting on Yiddish theater. And I mean, there was some of that creativity in the ghetto as well, but it's just a very different, picture than those who left in the 1890s from a world that was, where Yiddish seemed in totally good shape. And then it was like, we're just a few people leaving here. I mean, it'd been more than a few ultimately, but I think attention to the particular waves, sometimes kind of micro waves. I remember Boris actually wonderfully asking me, somebody I was seeing at the time, her family were Polish Jews who had left in the 60s, which was a very particular thing. And he said, the Gomułka wave. And he knew exactly what that meant. Right. It was after Gomułka took over and started doing the usual kind of stuff. Not big in terms of historical. This was a relatively small group of people, but they had a very particular historical trajectory and had come from a very particular situation. And he knew exactly what that meant and what formed them. And this is true of so many immigrant groups. So I think it's something that I try to pay attention to in Language City. If you came during the first Trump administration, if you came during COVID, before COVID, it also depends what was happening in your country, what historical experiences had formed you, what the status of the various languages were at that time. These are all formative factors that one has to really kind of understand in fine-grained detail to know, how it all unfolded.
So I've been conducting this interview with the premise that basically you could talk to many people about urban linguistic diversity, and that we should instead direct this to Yiddish and Jewish topics as a unique opportunity. But there is a line in Language City that I want to ask you about that really you just hinted at. It has to do with the notion of a soul of a city. You write that linguistic diversity is, quote, also part of the city's soul, explaining its particular capacity for tolerance and ability to make room for others, however fraught and grudging, given long histories of segregation and 1,000 local flavors of racism. I'm curious, when you started thinking about this and how you got on this notion of a soul of a city. I mean, none of this is to say that I disagree with you, but I want to know more about this idea. Does the city have one soul or does it have many? Do the urban souls migrate? Can urban souls become Gilgulim, going from one generation into another? Can they become a Dybbuk, trapped in a host that can no longer really tolerate that soul?
This really demands a sequel to Language City 2. to think what happens. I feel like I at least document the move from Manhattan to Queens. I've been in my own peregrinations around New York. I'm sort of trying to chase the soul. I've currently traced it to Ridgewood, Queens, where I feel that it's pretty strong, and that may be based on a particular view of New York. I think there are many such souls. I think probably my earliest notion of this was, I think this is a term of art, I'm not sure, like the idea of a soul of the city columnist. There were these columnists. Who was it in Chicago? Boyko, what's his?
Oh yeah, Mark Royko.
Yeah. Pete Hamill, it's Jimmy Breslin. I'm sure nobody.
Herb Cain.
Herb Cain in San Francisco. I'm sure nobody under 40 has.
Jonathan Gold in LA.
Oh, you're good on this. Yeah. I kind of love this genre of urban writing. They come from a high point of urbanism and certainly of like the Metropolitan Daily newspaper, which I also venerate some of that tradition. Who knows what it means these days? So there's a little bit of that notion in there for me. And then I'm probably also drawing on kind of romantic notions from Romanticism. But I'm also kind of influenced by Ian Sinclair's style, psychogeography, if you know the London writer Ian Sinclair. The idea that places, the genius loci, this is kind of actually an old notion, the spirit of place, which has been around for some time. So in my favorite urban writing, I see an interest in the genius loci. I see a kind of almost spiritual apotheosis in urban form and urban life. So I think I've tried to transpose this or flip it on its head in a certain way. And who knows if if I've in any way succeeded, but I do posit that somewhere at the close to the soul of New York, which itself is built superposed on Lenape-Hoking. I think this is also another aspect of this, is that the soul of a place is also connected to its indigenous roots. And this is something that I think more people are feeling and seeing, even if they're only hearing now and understanding now that there were indigenous languages and peoples under their place. And I don't think necessarily a cursory symbolic land acknowledgement will do that much justice. It may be seen by some as progress, but at a deeper level, just to recognize that there are layers of a place, and you need to understand they actually can all be present at once, but they also represent a kind of stratigraphy of a place. To me, close to the soul of New York as I know it is its linguistic diversity, is its encapsulation of voices from all over the world, not as a kind of perfect microcosm, but a very convoluted and wild one of real particulars. And I think such a soul can be traced almost everywhere if we know how to look for it and we do the work to reveal it.
It's funny because I had someone recently tell me he's a former startup CEO. I think his company got fairly large, and he grew up here and went to New York and came back here. And he said, New York has a really strong public market mentality, and this area has a strong private market mentality. And this is a very different soul of the city than what you described, but another one that goes on. And I wonder how your organization advocates for a particular ethos and a particular tolerance towards others at a time when that's obviously very threatened. And so how do you make sure that your soul stands out in against these rivals?
The open city, I think, it's different from the open society as it was theorized by, was it Jaspers? I think that cities are places in general that are, unlike often villages or rural areas or home areas, cities are places that should be open and that benefit from this life force of people, of the tidal movements of people in and out. And I do think at the deepest level, this is what we are about at the Endangered Language Alliance, and it's what New Yorkers, the capacity to make room for others. This is ultimately what it should be about in cities and what it's been about in New York for hundreds of years. And that shouldn't change.
We close these interviews by offering you the opportunity to share a quote that you find meaningful from the field of Jewish studies, a Jewish text, or any other text you find relevant to our contemporary moment. Ross Perlin, what did you bring?
I suppose we could do a further kind of drosha on a Sprache as a dialect mit an Armee und a Float, which is at the center of so many of these discussions. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy, which I mentioned in the talks, but is now a core tenet of sociolinguistics. And as you say, think about, does it have to be an army and a navy? Is it the Shomrim and the school board? What other things could we substitute there? And what forms of power? If we admit that power is somewhere close to the center of these questions, But we can also think that there might be many different forms that power takes, and the cultural power, perhaps the spiritual power, the social power. Can it be an army of Kulturtour and a navy of similar? That's something I'd like to think about more.
Well, Ross Perlin, thank you for coming back to Stanford. And now Stanford is returning the favor and coming to you in New York. Ross will be lecturing at the Stanford's Overseas Studies program in New York City this coming quarter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Shalom down, Eitan. Thank you so much, everyone.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shana Hammerman, along with Eva Clem and Nilofar Saraj. Sound design by Romy Chikorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.